Hello everyone and welcome back to the second video on the Rosa Limo with g6, bishop takes c6, d takes c6. In this video we're not yet moving on to the main line, which, as I mentioned in the previous video, arises after the move bishop g7, h3, knight f6, followed by knight d7 and short castle. I want to spend this video looking at another way of black to try to sort of outsmart us and get a better setup than the one from the main line. And I think it's important to look at these lines first because it's interesting to realize why black is playing the way that he's sort of supposed to play in the main line. In this video we'll be looking at knight h6 briefly and mostly at the move b6, which seems kind of mysterious at first. Why would black play b6 without actually having the incentive to do so, because bishop e3 or some move like that attacking the c5 pawn has not yet been played. First of all, I want to look briefly at the move knight h6, which I think looks rather logical if we already know about the plan of playing f6, knight f7, followed by e5, which is a very solid setup. And if black manages to hold everything together on the queen side, especially the pawn on c5, that could be a very nice way to also prepare f5 in the future, which once again, if black ever gets to play that move, could be very dangerous. So knight h6 is actually the specialty of a Russian grandmaster named Ikonikov, who is playing in my country, the Netherlands, very often in the open tournaments, and I had several chances to face him, even though we never ended up playing, in which I was prepared for this variation, as he always plays knight h6. And once again we see the importance of the move a4 here. One interesting try and a reason how I got to this idea of a4 is bishop to e3, attacking the c5 pawn, which looks a little bit crazy because after bishop takes b2 you might think, well, aren't we losing material? But after knight d2 we cannot actually take on a1 as black because queen takes a1 leaves both the rook on h8 and the knight on h6 hanging, meaning that white is going to gain material out of this. However, black can play bishop to g7, and even though we can regain our pawn on c5, perhaps it's an option now for black to take on a1 because the knight is no longer hanging. And also, if he doesn't take on a1, I'm not 100% convinced of our position, as we've basically just traded the c-pawn for the b-pawn, which might not actually be such a great trade, and black might be able to get more influence in the center by playing b6, c5 later on here. But mostly bishop takes a1 here is what worries me, so I'm not 100% sure that we get enough compensation in this case. So knight h6 is kind of clever because black is preparing a setup that is not so easy to achieve by normal means. But the move a4 actually poses him some serious questions. First of all, do you want to allow to get a5? As we said before, this is kind of an achievement by white, as we're isolating the c-pawn, and it might result in black having to give up the a-file if he wants to aim for rook b8 and b6 to support that pawn, which is kind of a positional triumph for white. So instead I would think that black should play a5 as usual, but now the idea becomes a little bit more clear. After the move bishop to e3, once again it looks most logical for black to play bishop takes b2, knight d2, bishop to g7, and here instead of taking on c5 and once again allowing our rook to be taken, which means the sacrifice of an exchange, which I'm not sure about, I very much like white's position after the move rook b1. We see that even though we might still we might win our pawn back immediately, we have some very serious pressure going on there. Actually, after the move b6, knight to c4, it already looks very grim for black, as he can't really protect his pawn on b6 without making very strange concessions such as rook a6. Now this would probably hold on to the pawn for a little longer, but after something like queen d2, being forced to play knight g8, I'm convinced that white must have at least sufficient compensation, if not much more. So after a5, bishop e3, black could play other moves, but that already sort of defeats the purpose of the idea of knight h6. For example, f5 could be played, but I believe that after a simple knight d2, this is not really a healthy way for black to approach these kind of lines. And still the idea of f4 is not a big threat because our pawn on c5 is still under attack. So after short castle b6, for example, white could simply go for a few exchanges by taking on h6 here, takes, e takes f5. And we'll see this more often if black goes for an early f5, that normally we can just exchange several pieces and put our knights to e5, either from c4 and another one from f3, and use some of our heavy pieces on the e file, and it's just very hard for black to play around that. And that combined with the structural damage of both the e and the c pawn is just kind of granting white a stable advantage. So knight h6 is a very interesting move, but I don't think it's very good after a5, a4. One last idea for black is to just play f6, which would allow a5, as we can see here. And as we said before, we're pretty much happy with white in these types of positions. Here, instead of playing knight d2, knight c4, we have another interesting idea of playing knight to c3, which immediately threatens to play knight a4 as it stops b6 in some cases, whilst attacking it. And black has this interesting idea of going knight d8 here, which once again I want to show you that this is an important idea because it also actually defends the c-pawn. But in this case I don't think it really matters too much, because after knight d2 and knight a4, knight b3, we see that the c-pawn is actually under too much pressure regardless of the nice maneuver of the knight to e6. And after knight d4, knight takes c5, of course white's much better. So really nice maneuvers here by black, but it doesn't quite reach his goal. So knight h6 is not the move to be worried about, but remember a4 because it's a very nice idea, and perhaps you'll be able to use it in your games. Now the move b6 actually is a little bit smarter, as black still leaves us sort of hanging with regard to what he wants to do exactly. Does he want to switch back to the e5 setup maybe, or does he still want to go knight h6? I think the best move is just the castle over here. And the first question is, did black outsmart us by playing e5 here? Because if you remember from the last video, we said that we didn't want a castle if it comes down to making all those same moves. So something like a4, a5, knight a3, bishop knight e7, knight c4, f6, bishop to e3, bishop to e6, threatening here. Just to give you the example once again, if we go knight d2, which was kind of the move we wanted to play, now black will be able to play knight d5, right? So he sort of achieved his goal. Which means that we have to adjust to the situation over here. And we can do that by saying that after basically the move a3, preparing b4 in a different way, the move b6 is not entirely clear whether it's not entirely useful, basically. So even though black has kind of outsmarted us, we can just change plans in this case, and I think white gets a better position. This was a game of Sutovsky, and after a5, bishop e3, knight e7, knight d2, we're now preparing b4 in a different way once again. Something like bishop a6, queen b1 is a nice move preparing this, and I think that white was much better after the following sequence of moves. Castles a4, and white could follow up with moves like rook b1, knight c4, and maybe a well-timed a5. This is, by the way, also an interesting setup against the usual knight e7 variation without b6 that we saw in the previous video, but not quite as strong there, as it gives black a few more options to play without b6. So coming to the main variation in this video is the move knight to h6, and I hope that at this point you're already starting to recognize some of the patterns and some of the clever maneuvers and differences between some of these setups. That's really the key to this variation with d takes c6. So knight h6, once again preparing to play f6 and knight f7. Again, I like the idea that we've sort of seen before with a4, a5, and here I'm actually a little bit worried about the idea of black being able to play with that setup. So for example, if we would just go knight a3, f6, bishop e3, knight f7. I'm not entirely sure if I still like the same plan with knight to c4, because black could, for example, try to exchange the knights before us being able to play b4. So I'm not too keen on letting black get away with this maneuver, and I think we can stop it by playing bishop to f4, which to my knowledge is a novelty. The idea of bishop f4 is to actually prevent e5 altogether by playing e5 ourselves. So after the move f6, once again bishop takes b2 is possible, but it just leaves black in a very, very dubious position after rook to b1. The fact that our bishop on f4 definitely doesn't hurt us compared to the previous variation, and with knight c4 coming, I'm just not very worried that we don't have enough compensation. In fact, I think white is better in all of these positions. So f6 will be a more normal move for black. And after the move e5. Of course, we don't want to let black gain a tempo by playing e5 and hitting our bishop. Castles, and here rook to e1, very precise move. It's a little bit better against the g5 moves that we'll be looking at here than, for example, knight d2. There are a few subtle differences there. I think black is simply a little bit worse if he goes for knight to f7. We can just develop either knight d2 or knight c3, both look very healthy. But for example, knight to d2. Of course, a position like this is not really worrying us too much. This is just, once again, structural deficit on black on two parts of the board, the C pawn and the E pawn. And yeah, very easy play here for white. So g5 would be kind of a way to steer the game into sort of sharp territory, but after bishop h2, and here for example g4, takes, knight takes, bishop to g3, we see one of the ideas why it was kind of important to wait with knight d2, because after the move f5 we can now very comfortably play queen d2, stopping this idea of f4, and we can develop our knight to c3 and actually use this square later on in the game. So this is once again better for white. And this actually puts an end to this variation with b6, but for my own practice I faced this variation once against a slightly weaker player, and I had a very hard time beating him when I went for kind of a more normal setup with bishop e3, and I allowed this knight f7 setup. So it's very important to remember what sort of maneuvers we can allow and what sort of maneuvers we can't allow. And knight h6 followed by f6, knight f7 without black committing to at least allowing us to play something like a4, a5 or something important that gives us play on the queen side is generally a bad sign. So this is really the way to counter this setup for black. Once again, a4 is the way to go, and then instead of bringing the bishop to e3 where it would normally gain a tempo against the pawn on c5, we can now play bishop f4 with the idea of e5. So an important difference. A clever idea by black to play b6, and it has been tried in practice quite a bit, but as we've seen, it's not quite good enough to equalize, and white's better here. In the next video we're going to be looking at the main line, where a lot more strategic ideas will become apparent, and I hope you're enjoying the videos, and I hope to see you back then.